Thank you. David Wood has a question. Says, this is extremely compelling and useful work. Thank you both. It seems that resistance to reparations is itself a product of and a particular kind of the harms that the Black community has suffered, which analogizes to the Japanese internment case, but perhaps less to say than the vaccine case. How does this resistance to reparations change the politics that we've talked about? Clearly, some members of the political community are behind this, but there is strong resistance in some quarters. And I don't know if you can comment on winning over the folks who are resisting so strongly.
So I think Linda is precisely right that part of the resistance is the way in which we frame the question and frame the debate, right? So in other words, if reparations is about something in the long ago past, those very much in the present don't feel responsible for it, particularly if their forebears came to this country well after the 13th Amendment. So there's the matter of framing the debate such that we understand that these racial harms may be rooted in chattel slavery, but they extend well into the present. Point one. Point two, engaging in narrative, a kind of narrative shift, right? In other words, the math is critically important, but the stories are critically important. Then the narrative and the narrative aspect of this and the empirical aspect of this have to be yoked, right? So in other words, we have to see a certain kind of fiscal way forward, but we also need a kind of narrative urgency. In other words, people need to fully appreciate that American GIs who literally fought fascism abroad and Nazism abroad came back home to Jim Crow, and the Jim Crowization, if you will, of the GI Bill meant that they had lack of access with respect to education and housing, and that had consequences not only for those who served, but it had consequences for their children and their grandchildren that can be felt today. Once we broaden the discussion, lift up the story in ways in which people see themselves, but we also make it clear that we can be fiscally prudent, we can be programmatically thoughtful, and that we have all manner of precedent before us. In other words, we engage in reparatory justice every day. We just don't call it that. That's one way to shift the debate forward.
Thank you. Valley Bear has asked a question. Can you comment on the example in Evanston, Illinois, of recently offering some reparations? Is that a helpful way to address reparations as a start? And if I could also ask that you perhaps tell us what has happened in Evanston, Illinois, for those of us who may not be fully aware.
You know, I can, Linda, but I think Hillary is on the line. She convened the conference in which we had the council person who actually drafted that piece of legislation. Is that Hillary? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. So Robin Ruth Simmons, who is an alderman from Evanston, Illinois, recently passed what's being hailed as like a reparations provision within the city of Evanston, Illinois. It's, I think, currently focused primarily on home loans to Black homeowners who were living in the city during the time of a lot of housing discrimination. But I think she has plans to further kind of develop and expand on that initial plan. I think that something that I recently had a conversation with her and Professor Brooks, and something that really stood out to me in that conversation was what the cities and some of the states are doing really serves as proof points for the federal government in order to make a move in the future. So this isn't to say that any of what a state is doing or what a locality is doing should supersede the call for federal reparations, but it is to say that what these cities and states are doing can serve as the groundwork and also help to serve as momentum building for an eventual federal plan. So I think that there's some people that maybe note a tension between state and city reparations, reparatory justice programs, and what the federal government should do. I think that there is still an obligation for the federal government to act, but the work of Alderman Simmons and other local leaders like her is really valuable for the overall movement towards reparatory justice.
And And wouldn't it also be true that because, to Linda's point, because they identified a discrete harm, that is to say people lived in the city during a period of housing discrimination, and they took an excise, imposed an excise tax on the cannabis industry and used that to fund the program, which speaks to the point that Linda made, that you can have reparatory justice with funding streams that look a lot like what we do every day.
Great, thank you. Somewhat related to that is, in addition to the program in Evanston, Illinois, are there other states that are doing something that is worth mentioning in this forum to sort of help inform what the federal government might do? And I guess a second related question is the research that you're doing now, is that being replicated at a state level anywhere? What other groups are looking at the specifics of reparations that that you might be able to comment on?
I may be not the best person to comment on this, but I do work with a lot of state and local governments. I mean, I think state and local governments are of course, they're referred to as, laboratories of innovation and democracy and so forth. And they do serve very much as labs in that they try a lot of different things, and some of them stick and some don't. So California, where I grew up, was a complete pioneer in terms of vehicle CO2, emission controls and so forth, 20 years before anybody else was thinking about it. Not everything that state and local governments try is applicable nationwide or works. And I think it's a great thing for a national commission, which I hope we have, to study comprehensively all of the various efforts that state and local governments have undertaken. I do think that state and local governments have a lot to tell us about different ways of funding programs and different eligibility criteria and things like that. What is lacking at the state and local level is a national acknowledgement of the scale of harms of that have derived from the period of years of slavery and Jim Crow and everything that followed. And I think that in order to give a boost both to federal programs and to state and local efforts, there needs to be a national moment of, which I hope can come through a commission to acknowledge that this is something that we need to think about in the same way that we have thought about so many other kinds of harms. And one of the things that is most interesting to me about looking at all these programs is that in the same way California pioneered no-fault divorce, the federal government grasps very well that it is not always somebody's fault. So decisions have consequences, and as Cornell described in detail, the fact that the GI Bill was, as it turned out, an engine of inequality for Blacks was not because the GI Bill itself was bad, but because of various other forces that conspired to make it not work for Black Americans. And that sort of issue about how is it that we keep doing all kinds of things and somehow many of them are not helping the intended beneficiaries, and we have a whole generation of individuals who have been harmed by consequences of all of these things. That national moment of trying to examine it, even if imperfectly, is something that I believe needs to happen at the national level.
I would just add for additional examples of where these reparatory justice programs are kind of taking place. California recently passed a law to establish a commission to study reparations proposals. So that is some action there in terms of a commission that could potentially maybe be a model for a federal commission and how they would go about reading through literature and making determinations. There's also the example of another locality in Florida, Rosewood, and compensating victims of a massacre, racial massacre, back in the 1920s. And then there's also the example of universities, right? So there was what happened with Georgetown in the recent kind of rediscovering of their connections to the slave trade in order to fund the school and the program that they now have established for descendants of those enslaved individuals. So there are multiple examples, popping up. So I would encourage people to go take a look at all of those programs as well.
Yeah. And I would just note that we had a group of Harvard Kennedy School students who, in one of my classes, worked with the state of New Jersey to develop a reparations commission, and they specifically looked at the effect of this debate on children and the effect of literally the last northern state to abolish slavery, New Jersey, the consequences of chattel slavery on the present, and particularly children. So as Hillary lifted up and Linda lifted up, wonderful examples popping up, all of which point to the road that the federal government can take and should take, and is uniquely positioned to take. But they, to Linda's point, are laboratories of democracy, but they don't suggest that the federal government or Congress should forfeit its role.
Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our time, sadly, but now you are currently in the process of writing up your paper, I believe. Can you tell us when we might expect to have that available?
I'll let Linda tell us that.
We're hoping to put out a working paper on Juneteenth. And we hope that that stimulates discussion. I mean, we've been invited to write an article for the Atlantic. We are, our students are working on various enhancements now and on the visualizations and so forth. And so I think that we will hope very much that this sparks a conversation and as we call it, a reimagining of the question.
Thank you very much, Cornell Brooks, Linda Bilmes, Hillary Anderson. This has been a terrific session, and we wish you all the best of luck in your follow-on work on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.